All right, Derege joins us now to discuss the Ethiopian Constitution and the role it plays in conflict and peace in Ethiopia. Derege, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for inviting me.
My
Excited to be here.
my pleasure. This is a hot topic, especially in the midst of this war, but it's been an ongoing conversation. In Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Constitution was established in 1994, and in its establishment, it says it created a federal and democratic state structure. But many argue it doesn't create either one of those. Can you?
Yes, so when you think of federalism, you think of local rule. And the whole concept of federalism is to distribute power from bottom up and make sure that the central government doesn't control every aspect of life at the periphery. So when you have states that in a federal system, they will have their own constitution. You will have a federal law and a federal constitution that pretty much provides the basic minimum guaranteed rights individuals have, and also delineates power of the federal government vis-a-vis the individual. And then you have states that control certain aspect of people's lives in education, healthcare, and some cultural issues and stuff like that. But even within that system, within the states, you have local rule at city, county, and different levels. In the Ethiopian context, what we had was a pseudo federal system in name only, where the central government that was controlled by one party, which had which created a coalition from different other parties, but essentially controls what those parties do. That party was able to create a system whereby it assigns different parties to rule over certain areas, each state, and they operate sort of as a client government for that party. So what I'm saying is the TPLF that controlled the Ethiopian government for about 20 years had these other parties, the Oromo, Amhara, and Southern Peoples, and the Afar, different parties that were assigned to rule over different states with the permission and acquiescence of the TPLF leaders. And if they actually don't follow what they're told, they would be replaced. So you don't have a federal system per se. You had one party controlling the entire country. In addition, their state's supposed to have their own constitution. But if you look at the Ethiopian system, each state has a constitution, but it's verbatim the same constitution that was written and given to them. The only difference between one state and another state is the name for Amhara is replaced with Tigray or Oromo. And as you know, the federal system is an ethnic federal system where the country was divided at the time along 9 ethnic federal states. And the dominant ethnic group within each of those states was assigned to rule over those states. And in a country that has 80 different, more than 80 different ethnic groups, it was neither an ethnic federalism or nor a federal system. When you talk about democracy, we're talking about elected government, and we didn't have that either. The other interesting aspect is a lot of people debate about, whether there's going to be, we should change the constitution or not, whether there should be ethnic federalism or unitary system. And what I say to people is focus on the concept of distribution of power. Distribution of power at the federal level between the executive, legislative, and judiciary, but also within the states, each at each level, whether you're at Kabele or zone or district level, you need to have a system where people can elect their leaders at every stage. If you guarantee that kind of system in a country that has 80 plus ethnic groups, you will have a truly democratic system. But you cannot rely on just creating one ethnic uh, group that is in power of this one state, and that ethnic group gets to say what happens within that entire region, whether you're in Oromia or Tigray or Afar and Amhara. There are other groups that live in those regions. So you have to create a system where power just is distributed throughout the country. So the question is not central ethnic federalism or whatever. It's let the people decide what they want at every stage of the every stage of government. And government is not just federal and state. It's local, it's cities, it's counties, it's zones. So let them have their own elected officials. Let them decide how they educate their children, how they promote their culture. And you may have 3 or 5 different educational priorities, and you may have a uniform standard. That's fine. But each area can tweak their education system. But make sure that they don't violate the federal constitution, the minimum rights people have, people who may be different from others in that area. Their federal rights need to be protected. And the whole concept is states can give more rights, but cannot give less rights than the federal system. But they can have more rights. They can say, in this area, you have more protection from our police than the federal government gives you. You can do that. But what you cannot do is you say you have less right because we want to have, we want to live this way, we want to do things this way, and we don't like what the federal government says, and therefore you're going to abide by our rule. That's not going to happen in a federal system. So the federal law has to be supreme law of the land. People need to be empowered to elect their leaders at all levels. And this whole idea of one ethnic group controlling the entire region, that's inconsistent with the concept of federalism, inconsistent with the concept of democracy. So that's what we need we should talk about. Whether you want your kid to be raised in one little area, go to school there, get married there, get old there, and die there. And the minute they decide to venture off and go to another region, they have less rights. They cannot do this, they cannot do that because they're not from that area. If you want that kind of system, you design a different rule and a different legal structure. But if you want a system where people have equality, democratic rights, freedom, wherever they go, and those rights are not checked off at the border of every state, and they travel with them, then you design a different system. So that's really the discussion. That's what has to be the discussion, not whether you want this, you want that, ethnic federalism and central, because we never had democracy, we never had a true federal system. Let's not kid ourselves. We're gonna have to start from new.
In these ethnic federalist states, it essentially is implying that in Oromia, ethnic Oromos can have more rights than any other ethnicity because this is their region. When a lot of ethnic Amharas live there in the Amhara region, it implies that ethnic Amharas have more rights than Oromos or any other ethnicity in that region. Is that the source? I mean, this is what people say all the time, right? Is that the source of a lot of the ethnic conflict that we're seeing in many of the regions?
So it's a byproduct of a system where you create a region based on ethnic group and say, this region belongs to these people. If you look at the constitution of these states, they actually wrote, this land is the is owned by these people, right? As if those are the only people who live in that land. So uh, it's a byproduct of a mentality that a land belongs to this group and that group, right? Land belongs to whoever lives in that land. Ethiopia belongs to all Ethiopians, right? So that's the whole concept of being a citizen of a nation. When you're a citizen of a nation, you can go anywhere you want. You don't need a passport within that nation. You have the same right as anyone else. Now, there's certain privileges that you get from being a resident of an area. But once you become a resident, you acquire those things. No one's going to tell you, for example, you can't have a driver's license in California or Virginia so long as you live there. Maybe if you don't live there, they're not going to give you a driver's license because driving in those places is not a right; it's a privilege. But they cannot tell you you don't have a right to remain silent when a police officer talks to you because that's your constitutional right. They cannot take certain rights away from you that you get from the federal constitution, right? The American Constitution doesn't tell you you have a right to drive a car. Okay, you don't have that right. The states would say you can drive a car if you're licensed. Then they have their rules. You abide by them. But they can't tell you if you're black, you can't drive in California. That's a problem. And if you're Mexican descent, you can't drive in Colorado. That's a problem. That's when you go to court and say this law violates my federal constitutional right, and then that law becomes invalid. So, but if you divide the United States in different parts and say this land belongs to Irish Americans, this land belongs to German Americans, this land belongs to Mexican Americans, and you allow those groups to create a party to rule those areas, what do you think is going to happen? A
Right.
byproduct of that is whoever else is not those people who live in that area is going to get shafted. It's going to suffer discrimination. So I think what we now see in Ethiopia, something that did not exist before, is the sense that certain people should leave certain areas. No one ever said that before. No one ever says, you don't belong here, you need to leave this area. What is that? Where is that coming from? That comes from this concept of this land is so and so's land, this region is so and so's region. But in reality, people have been moving all over the world, all over the country. Ethnic groups have moved about. Romos have moved from south to north. Amharas have moved from north to south. Everyone has been moving everywhere, getting married, intermarriage, intermingling, and it's hard to find a place that is completely homogeneous in any part of the country. So we need a 21st century law that is consistent with the aspiration of a 21st century mentality and percept. What we tried to create in the past 30 years is a 16th century law that governs people in 21st century. So we need to move from this concept that we live in these fixed enclaves and we don't venture off. The funny part is you have these ethnic leaders who live in UK and the United States. They own homes. They have their kids going to nice schools here and everywhere, but they want people from one region to be kicked out, and they want Amharas to leave Oromo land, Oromos to leave Amhara land. But Why are you in the UK to begin
Right. Or in the US where there's so much diversity. I mean, it's when you
what are
just
you doing here?
the logic is just it leaves like really pretty quickly. This at the logic of ethnic federalism, it's like you
Yeah,
can't, it doesn't stay consistent for long. I think it's always helpful to give examples of, what if it was like this in the United States or in the UK, that hypothetical situation that you gave in terms of discrimination of who can get a license and who can't based on race, which is unconstitutional here based on the federal constitution. I mean, that's essentially what's been happening in Ethiopia for a long time. We've seen it in Amhara and Oromia
yeah,
regions. We've seen it in the Welkite corridor that TPLF annexed to beat Tigray when it came into power. So then it was discriminating against ethnic Amharas there, or people that they perceived to be ethnic Amharas. So is it fair and accurate to say that the current constitution in Ethiopia actually legalizes discrimination?
absolutely. Not only legalizes discrimination, it fosters discrimination. It promotes discrimination. And it promotes discrimination by its very structure. Right? When you have a country with 80 plus ethnic groups, but you have 11 states that are ruled by ethnic parties that control what happens in the entire state that they control, you're going to have discrimination. So long as you are trying to do things based on ethnicity, right, you are going to have excluded and included people. And the excluded people are going to be left out. And the name itself, Khalil, meaning exclusionary zone, right? So it is, the states are known as killers. That means this is an exclusionary zone. This is my zone. You don't belong here. And that kind of mentality feeds into, for example, this whole notion that Addis Ababa belongs to this ethnic group or that ethnic group. Why does a city belong to an ethnic group? Where does this concept come from? That uh, an area belongs to an ethnic. What does it mean to belong to an ethnic group? Does it mean every ethnic group member gets a piece of that property? Okay, so if I'm a Oromo, I get to claim some part of Addis Ababa. I mean, what's my share? And where's that coming from? How about a different ethnic group who's been living in Addis Ababa for generations? So what? They don't have any say in that. They don't own that. They don't own the land They've been living. So you need to we need to really think and rethink this whole concept of ethnic group owning things. It's individuals who own things, right? It's individuals who have rights and individuals who can enforce their rights in the court system. And this whole concept of group rights is a means to for few people at the top subjugate others. So, for example, in Tigray, you have TPLF and their leaders. They all talk about the rights of Tigrayans, but they throw Tigrayans in jail. They take all kinds of people from their families and send them to war. And if they don't, they send them to jail. They don't have any problem killing any number of Tigrayans because they supported the central government. They take them out and shoot them. Why? They do it in the name of promoting Tigrayans. So same thing the former dictator Mengistu did. In the name of the masses, he would kill 10,000 people. So uh, this whole concept that certain individuals are allowed to act on behalf of an entire ethnic group is ridiculous. You have to let people tell you what they want. Maybe they would disagree with you. Maybe this is not what they want. We live in a country where we don't do statistics. So no one knows what Oromos want. No one knows what Amharas want. It's not, I mean, is Amhara 1%?
Mhm.
Uh, you know, I will tell you, part of my family are Amaras. They don't agree on anything. I mean, on one day I may agree on this. I have also a whole family members who are Oromos. They disagree all the time, you know. And this whole idea that Oromos think this way, Amaras think this way, Oromos want this, Amaras want, Tigrayas are like, come on. We need to start talking about what people want, what individuals want. And you know how you know that? Through democracy. Let them decide and
Right,
tell
right.
you what they want. So, um, again, the whole idea that you have an ethnic group that picks its leaders who will act on behalf of everyone in the entire region, that's a recipe for an, an ongoing and non ending conflict. We need to start empowering individuals to assert their rights, to protect their rights, to exercise their democratic rights, to protect their individual freedom. And if you do that for everyone, they will tell you what they want. They will decide, they will elect who they want. Then they will have a system that they like because it's built based on their decision as opposed to the leaders.
Right. There's really no society without the individuals. I mean, this is, I think, especially embedded in Tigray, where being an individual voice that goes against the grain is literally fatal if you're in that region. And then if you're on the outside, it's just, there's so much resistance to it. But I was talking to somebody from Tigray, actually, that's outside of the region recently, and she made that point of, why do they think that we are a group or a society if they don't allow individuals to have their own opinion? I mean, they're absolutely fascist in their response as a group. And I guess that's something that's been cooked into the society for a long time. And you do see it in other ethnic groups as well. And then even the concept of ethnicity is so ambiguous sometimes. If you're in Addis Ababa and you speak Amharic, are you Amhara, or like, is it, you know what I mean? It's, some people say, I keep being told what ethnicity I am, and I never identified as that. It's not like race here that's a little bit more clear, but even with race here, there's some vague elements. So, but a lot of people would argue this constitution and the way it defines and promotes certain ethnic groups is a source of our issues. So why does it still exist? Right? Why, what will it take to change this constitution, and why do you think it hasn't already been reformed under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed?
Yeah, so that's a difficult conversation to have when you have all kinds of conflicts everywhere in the country, right? So one of the unfortunate things that happened in the past 2 years is that there was so much optimism when Abiy Ahmed came to power. As you remember, he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and there was peace with Eritrea, and things were going to improve. The country was going to focus on development and progress. And then there was this conflict in Tigray. It reminded me of if you remember when Obama got elected, and the Republicans say, I think it was Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, said, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure Barack Obama does not succeed and that he's going to be a one term president. And I feel like a certain type of mentality prevailed within the TPLF leaders. They were hell bent on making sure that um, Abiy Ahmed did not succeed, that his Nobel Peace Prize would be tarnished and all that. Because even as he was getting that prize, they were saying all kinds of things to undermine that. But there was this cynical attitude about this whole change, and they know now. They know. I think the Constitution is not going to serve them, but they use that as a wedge issue to say that changing the constitution would undermine all the progress ethnic groups have made in the past 30 years and would undermine the rights. Even when the TPLF leader, what's his name, the old guy, Sebadnego, when he got captured, he said, "Don't let them change the constitution." So that was his consistent message, is that they brought this ethnic federalism that liberated people, and the debate is whether there's going to be one party rule, which they call Adawi, or central one government, one central government versus federal system. But they forgot they never gave federal system. They never had a federal system, and people uh, at, in Ethiopia, these ethnic leaders bank on the fact that, or they hope, people will not think for themselves, right? So if you start thinking, you become immediately a threat. You have to repeat, regurgitate, and say what they tell you. And if you start saying, well, I think, what you're saying doesn't make sense. How about this? You immediately become a threat. The late Mario Como, not this governor, but the one, his dad used to say, if two people agree all the time, one of them is not thinking.
Mhm.
And and what they like is everyone agreeing with them, right? So if you're the Oromo leader, every Oromo has to agree with you. If they don't agree with you, then it's because they're not too Oromo.
They're a
Same thing.
traitor of their ethnicity or they're a
Yeah,
banda. I mean, it's literally in the
yeah,
language.
yeah. So this whole system is created with a false narrative, and they want to repeat that false narrative several times until people feel like, oh, your freedom is threatened. But can you tell me, um, if there's any single individual in any federal one of those states that would say to you, I feel completely free in my affairs from government intrusion. I feel like I have true democratic rights, and I feel like I have equal rights wherever I go in Ethiopia. No one will say that. Why do we have a system where no one will say they feel freedom, that they're equal everywhere, and they have true democratic rights? So I'm talking about democratic rights within the state and at the federal level. So if you can't have people say that, the problem is the law. It's the constitution. It's the legal system that does not allow you to say that. It's the legal system that did not allow for the creation of the tradition, the culture, to flourish, whereby people use the legal system to resolve their disputes. So if you go back to the basics, the purpose of the law is to resolve disputes. If you have conflict, if you have war, that's a failure of the system. The same thing happened in the U.S. in the during the Civil War. They When Lincoln got elected, that's when the southern states, the ones who tried to secede, started the war by firing at Fort Sumter. And when Lincoln got elected, he was an abolitionist. They knew what was coming, and they did not want to live under that system. They didn't go to court. They lost the federal election, so they resorted to violence. After that, the system recognized that inability to resolve issues through the court system would lead to a war, would lead to a dispute. And we in this country managed to resolve a lot of problems through the courts. You have, the civil rights movement. You have um, uh, where you have, for example, separate but equal schools. That was resolved through the courts with Brown versus Board of Education, right? Um, there were instances where the court system failed, but there were instances where the court system avoided conflict. During Trump recently, he sued so many times to overturn the the Constitution, the court system at least resolved that issue. There were still people who did not subscribe to, who did not like what the court decided, but there were very few minority who showed up at the Capitol and started rioting. But if you think of it, let's say there was no court system that decided those issues. All the 70 million people plus who voted for Trump would have been aggrieved if they believed the election was stolen. And if you didn't have a court system, at least that convinced overwhelming majority of those 70 million people to say there's no shenanigan, maybe it's, we lost the election, they stayed home. Those people would have come out and there would have been more conflict. So Bush versus Gore, the same thing. There was a time where no one knew who was going to be president. And the Supreme Court decided it was Bush. So everyone moved on. And if you didn't have that kind of independent system, if you had a Democratic Party that controlled Congress, and that party decides who the president is, that you would have a problem, right? So the system gets tested constantly. And the way the system responds to these conflicts is determinative of how a country can move on without resorting to violence.
You know, what's curious as far as it relates to the current conflict is, TPLF went ahead with the September elections, the regional elections, saying that it was illegal or unconstitutional for the federal government to delay its elections because of COVID. And after they declared that, a couple of months later, they went to war. So it was as if they were operating as if they still ran and dominated this federalist system. Can you talk about where they went wrong in terms of how to handle it and how the Constitution may have actually, that they wrote, may have backfired against them?
Yeah, so when you talk about a claim that something is unconstitutional, such as